Well, welcome everyone to our virtual seminar series on policing and police reform in the United States. It's a real honor and pleasure to have with us Professor David Harris from the University of Pittsburgh Law School, who will be sharing his recent book with us today. And of course, as always, we have Brandon Davis with us from the University of Kansas, who will be moderating our discussion. Let me just briefly introduce Professor Davis so you're familiar with him as he begins. He's the Semenko Chair and Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh Law School, where he teaches criminal law, criminal procedure, evidence, and other courses. His research and writing is devoted to the study of police conduct, search and seizure law, and the intersection of race and criminal justice. He's the leading national authority on racial profiling. His 2002 book, Profiles and Injustice, and his many scholarly articles on the topic resulted in new laws and regulations in half of the states and hundreds of American police departments. He's also the creator and host of the Criminal Injustice podcast, which I highly recommend, which has devoted since 2016 to interviews with justice system actors, advocates, journalists, and many others. The podcast discussed some of the most difficult problems in the criminal justice system. In Pittsburgh and other communities around the country, he's applied his work to creating better relationships between police and the communities they serve, particularly African-American communities, to bring about both respectful, just policing and public safety. This work resulted in David receiving the Jefferson Award for Public Service in 2015. David served on the Mayor's Community Task Force on Police Reform, which just released its report and recommendations last week. Today, David will speak to us about his latest book, A City Divided, Race, Fear, and the Law in Police Confrontations, published in 2020 by Anthem Press, which is available on Amazon, local independent bookstores, and everywhere else. It tells the story of one terrible incident of a police-civilian violence here in Pittsburgh, and the case's full journey through the legal system. But the book doesn't stop there. It tells us not just what happened, but why, and why these incidents of violence between police and civilians, particularly Black Americans, keep happening all over the country. And today, that subject could not be more timely. So here's how we're going to run today's talk. When I'm finished, David will begin his presentation. Everyone attending should already have their microphones on mute, and all microphones must remain muted. As questions occur to you, please write the questions in the chat, the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll keep track of these questions for David, and when he finishes, he'll take your questions. We're recording this presentation up until the point where we reach the Q&A for later use. Just remember, stay muted, and questions go below. But the moderator of our discussion today is Brandon Davis, who's an assistant professor of public affairs and public administration at the University of Kansas. His research focuses on American politics and public policy, race and ethnicity, as well as law and society. He was recently appointed by the governor of Kansas to a state commission that's tasked with studying issues of racial equity and justice in Kansas, and is beginning its work focused on law enforcement community relations. Brandon is a former predoctoral and postdoctoral research fellow at Brown University. His work focuses on normative and empirical approaches to institutions, participation, and criminal justice. And I thought I'd plug two of Brandon's most recent articles. One is Feeling Politics, Carceral Contact, Wellbeing, and Participation, which just came out recently in Policy Studies Journal, and Testing Mechanisms, Carceral Contact, and Political Participation, which has also just come out in Social Science Quarterly. So take a look at Brandon's publications as well. So without further ado, Professor Harris, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much. You've heard in the introduction that this was about an incident in Pittsburgh. There was one terrible incident in Pittsburgh in 2010, more than 10 years ago, but there were two stories. And I want to start by telling you both of those stories. If I can get this to there, we skipped. Let's start with the police story. On January 12th of 2010, 3 police officers in Pittsburgh, all in plain clothes and in an unmarked car, were doing a special job. They were in a special vehicle that was tasked with patrolling the streets of Homewood, a neighborhood in Pittsburgh with more than its share of violent crime. Their particular task was to look for guns and drugs in this neighborhood. As they rolled down Tioga Street on this January night, one of the 3 officers in the car said that he spotted a man sort of squishing up against the side of one of the small houses, trying to conceal himself. So the 3 officers, the car went down the block, turned around, came back to the spot. And when they got there, they found a man coming out to the street just exactly in the same place. The unmarked car came to a stop. The one officer opened his door, put his leg down, got up, stood up, showed his badge, said, "Pittsburgh Police, would you mind taking your hand out of your pocket?" The man did as he was asked, but right away, that police officer and the 2 others saw the signs. This man was armed. They'd had special training in how to recognize an armed individual, and they saw those signs, a certain way of standing, a bulge in a coat pocket, a hand over that coat pocket, and they had a strong feeling this man was armed. It only took 1 or 2 more questions to the man before he began to run. He broke into a solid run, but he didn't get very far because the street and the sidewalk and everything else were covered with snow and ice, and he slipped and fell straight down onto the ground face first. All 3 of the police officers were out of that car right away, yelling, "Pittsburgh Police, stay on the ground, stay on the ground." But the man pushed himself up as if he was going to get up. And so right away, these 3 police officers were on the man, trying to get him to stay down. And he fought them. And boy, he fought them hard and kept fighting them and would not obey commands to stay down and put his hands behind his back. And when one of the man's hands, the right hand, got loose and went toward that right coat pocket where they'd seen the bulge, one of the officers called out, "He's going for it. He's going for the gun." And in that moment, all 3 of the officers thought the same thing. We're going to be shot. He's going to shoot. And the officer who was then closest to the man's head rained the heaviest blows he could muster right down on the man's head. And finally, he gave up. He went limp. They sat him up, went right for that right coat pocket, and they pulled out a bottle of Mountain Dew soda. They knew there was a gun around, so they searched the whole coat. They searched the ground. They kicked through the snow. They searched and they searched. No gun. But for years, the officers have insisted that man had a gun. They called a police wagon. The wagon came, took the man first to the hospital and then to jail. There's another story. This is Jordan's story. On January 12th, about 11 o'clock at night, Jordan, who was 18 years old, just turned 18 the day before, high school senior, honor roll, went to the Creative and Performing Arts High School. Jordan left his mother's house that night on Tioga Street to walk around the block, which he did every single night because the little house that he and his mother and his 3 siblings lived in was pretty tight, and his grandmother lived around the block on Susquehanna Street. And that's where he had his bedroom. And it was just good for the entire family for him to have more room. He'd done this since 7th grade. He left the house. He got just a house, 2 houses, maybe 3 houses down when he saw a dark colored car down the block come up very fast and just about hit him, pull right up almost on him, so much so that he kind of jumped back. He kind of had to jump back towards the sidewalk. He'd been walking on the street because the sidewalk was completely covered in ice and snow. And these 3 very big men came out of that car as soon as it stopped. They were all wearing just regular clothes, and they were yelling top of their lungs, "Where's your gun? Where's the drugs? Where's your money? Where is it?" He didn't know what was up with this, but he knew there was crime in this neighborhood. He figured he was getting robbed. He was terrified, and he tried his best to run. And he only got 3 or 4 steps before he just slipped and fell face down in the snow. And the men were on him instantly, hitting him, beating him. And his face was stuck down in the snow. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't get his breath. And every time he tried to raise his head up just a little bit so he could breathe, more hits, more blows. And finally, a huge set of crushing blows landed on his head. And he figured, well, I'm going to die here. And he stopped struggling. He just put his face down. It was a moment later when the men pulled him up, and he saw from the corner of his eye, up came a police vehicle, one of those trucks, and 2 men in uniform came out of it and walked right toward him. He figured, oh my God, that's great. One of my neighbors saw this and called the police. But then the 2 men in uniform started talking to the other 3 guys. And that was the first he knew that these were police officers, all of them. They put him in the back of that truck, took him to the hospital, and took him to jail. So 1 incident and 2 stories. Now, these stories vary at some very critical points. The police say they identified themselves multiple times. He would have known for sure, this young man, that we were the police. Jordan says they never said anything like that. They never said police. I saw no badges. They just came running out of that car yelling about guns and drugs. They agree that he tried to run and he fell face down. They say, the police officers, that is, that Jordan definitely had a gun. They'll say it to this day that he had a gun. Jordan says he not only never had a gun, but he didn't have one that night, and he doesn't drink Mountain Dew either and didn't have one with him. So there are differences, and they're important. I am really confident that anybody who reads the book will have all the facts they need to come to their own conclusion about what happened. I am completely confident about that. But honestly, there might be 2 more important things than that. Number 1 is that Jordan lived. You and I both know the names of plenty of people who have not survived these kinds of encounters. And his voice can be present in the book, and it is. He gets to tell his own story, unlike so many others. But the second thing that is so important is this. It's not just about what happened, but why. Why did this happen? Why does it keep happening all over the United States every single day in cities and towns everywhere? Because if we can figure out why this happens, maybe we have a shot at figuring out how it can happen less. How we can minimize these terrible incidents, even if we can't stop them all together. So the central question is really why. Let me tell you a little bit more about what happened, and then we'll get to that central question of why. Chances are really, really good that we would not be sitting here. There would be no book. Nobody would know Jordan's name in Pittsburgh or anywhere else if this case had just gone on. The police charged Jordan with some fairly serious felonies for the fight and some misdemeanors too. He was facing charges. He was injured, and that would have been that. He would have gone to court and the thing would have been somehow resolved. But about 10, 12 days, I want to say, after the incident, these pictures hit the media. Now, these are not the only ones, and they are not the worst ones. Put yourself back in 2010 if you can. We don't have stuff going viral via smartphone, right? It's still the world in 2010 of 4 local newscasts, 2 newspapers in this town that published every day. These pictures were everywhere, and the outrage over this was instantaneous. Instantaneous. It was the mayor, it was the chief of police. The officers were suspended. Everybody was asking, what? Why did this? How could this happen? How does a 5'6", 150-pound viola player end up on the bottom of a pile of three 6', 200-pound police officers getting beaten like this? How does this happen? Right outside of his own house. What happened? How? Why? And the kids were the first to react. These are the students from Jordan's Creative and Performing Arts High School marching from their downtown campus across the downtown to the city county building where they held a demonstration. And the kids were not alone. The adults, everybody. I mean, it was just everywhere. The demonstration started and they did not stop. As I said, the officers were suspended, investigations began, and the demonstrations continued and continued and did not let up. But the outrage in Pittsburgh was not all of one type, it turned out. We found this out just about 6 weeks, 7 weeks later in the early part of March, when the case against Jordan went to court for its first court proceeding, a preliminary hearing. And the judge hearing the preliminary hearing, which is usually a slam dunk for the prosecution, the judge threw the charges out against Jordan. Every single one of them just threw them out. And it's impossible to read the opinion or the transcript without understanding that the judge simply did not believe the police officers. And now the outrage emerged in the other direction. Police, the FOP, their many allies in the city structure and the population of our city came out and they were mad. They were angry. And we really saw a real demonstration of this in one of our premier civic events, the St. Patrick's Day Parade, which came just a couple of weeks later, or maybe 10 days in 2010. The police and the FOP had always marched in this parade, and they did so this year too. Let me show you what the police contingent looked like. This is our police. And they're marching with this shirt. It's a little blurry in this image, but here, I'll give you a little close up. We support our three brothers with the thin blue line running through the words three and brothers. I don't have an image of the front of the shirt, but it has four big numbers, 3599. And that was the radio call sign for the car from which those three officers came that night in Homewood on Tioga Street. And there was more outrage. How could the police do something like this when the investigation was just getting started and the police department was saying, don't rush to judgment? Here they were. Here they were. And the city was divided and remained so over this case. I referenced three investigations. There were three investigations. There was a federal Department of Justice investigation of the police to see if they would be criminally charged. There was an investigation on the state law level by our district attorney, who was investigating whether excessive force was used and would the police officers be charged. And there was an internal investigation to see whether the police officers would be subject to discipline or even firing. And you remember by this time, the charges against Jordan had been thrown out. Well, as these investigations chugged forward, it took months, but finally the feds came out. That was our United States Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania, representing the Department of Justice. And our United States Attorney announced he simply could not charge the police officers. He did not have what he thought was sufficient evidence. Why? Because the law in this area, it relies on a very old federal statute that says it's about whether a person willfully subjects any inhabitant to the deprivation of any rights, privileges, or immunities secured, protected by the Constitution. What does that mean? Well, according to the Supreme Court back in 1945, it means not just force, not just excessive force, but willfully means a purpose to deprive a person of a specific constitutional right. right? That's the highest standard in the criminal law. So it really isn't a big surprise that the feds didn't go forward. They actually pretty seldom do. The next day, so this would have been May 4th, 2011, 17 months after the incident, the feds announced they won't go forward. The next day, this happens. This is our then chief of police, Nathan Harper, at the microphones. Next to him is our boy mayor then, Luke Ravenstall. And Chief Harper is here reinstating the three officers. He's taking them off suspension. He's putting them back on duty. He says in his press conference, this is Jordan's fault. He ran. He shouldn't have run. Quote, we're not the enemy out there. And then he lets slip something that was not yet public. The internal investigation was already done. There would be no discipline against the officers of any kind. Certainly not firing, but no discipline at all. It took a whole nother year for the district attorney to come forward with his investigation, no charges. So that's where it all sat 2.5 years after it started. No charges against Jordan, thrown out. No federal charges against the officers. No state charges against the officers. No discipline at all. So if there was going to be any reckoning with what happened here, it would have to come in the civil courts. There was a lawsuit that was filed by Jordan against the city and the three officers. If anybody was going to have to take responsibility, that's where it would occur. Now, let me pull back from the story for a moment, because I said the core here, the most important thing perhaps, is why this keeps happening. And my answer to that, I mean, there are many, many possible causes you could put your finger on, but the two most prominent to me, the things I kept coming back to as I did the research over and over, were these two things: race and fear. Race and fear are the twin toxins, the two poisons that cause these things to happen over and over again, and that make police encounters with civilians, but especially people of color, much more dangerous than they need to be, and sometimes even fatal. Let's start by talking about the effect of race. We've known for a long time, the literature has been really, really clear that the dominant stereotype in American society of Black Americans, particularly Black men, is that they are criminal, they are violent, they are dangerous. There's no questioning this anymore. The work is so deep and so well documented. But in the last 20 to 25 years, the social scientists, particularly the social psychologists, have given us a much deeper and more nuanced and even disturbing understanding of the effect of race in our interactions with each other, and particularly how that applies to the interactions of police and people of color. All right. I'm going to show you just a few pieces of the science from this field. I think you'll find them very, very compelling. The first one I want to talk about is this: Seeing Black, Race, Crime, and Visual Processing. The team here was led by Jennifer Eberhardt, the distinguished professor from Stanford, MacArthur Genius awardee. And among her people on the team is Philip Atiba Goff, who is now a force in his own right, has been for years, was her student, I think, back in the day. The idea here is to test in a series of experiments, and this piece covered 7 different experiments, to test the effect of seeing a Black person's face on visual processing in American humans. And they did this in a whole variety of ways. I'll tell you about just one of these. They show the experimental subject, the person who is the subject of the experiment, they show the person a series of 41 images, one after the other. And they start off with a very degraded visual field. When I say that, envision, when you used to go to your grandparents' house, you turn the TV between channels, that snow, right, like that. That's a degraded visual field. And hidden way in the back of all that visual noise is the outlines of an object. Sometimes it's a weapon. Sometimes it's an innocuous piece of like a tool or a household item. It's whatever, right? And as the series of slides moves on in the series, the object becomes a little clearer and a little clearer and a little clearer. The way they do this experiment is by priming. They prime the person who is the experimental subject with a picture, a black person's face, a white person's face, no face. That's the prime. The prime is just flashed on the screen before they start going through the series of 41 slides. Here are the series of slides. I'll show you just a little slice of this so you get the idea and you don't have to rely on my description. Here's number one, all the way on the left. See, it's highly degraded, very hard to know what's there. By the time you get to the middle of the series, you can begin to make it out. And then at the end, it's clear what that is. The people shown the prime of a black person's face pick this item out much earlier in the series than people shown the prime of a white person's face or people shown no face at all. All right? A black face gets the mind and the visual system processing in a way that allows people to pick out crime-related objects in the series much more rapidly than otherwise. There are other pieces of this brilliant set of experiments. I can talk about more about them in Q&A. Here's another experiment I want to tell you about. This one was done by Philip Atiba Goff and his own team 10 years later. The Essence of Innocence, Consequences of Dehumanizing Black Children. What this team discovered is that when people look at photographs, look at images of black children versus white children and others, they see the black children, they overestimate their size, their age, their muscularity, and whether or not they are threatening by a significant amount as compared to estimating those same variables for white children. You may recognize this person. This is 12-year-old Tamir Rice. Now, if that name doesn't mean anything to you, I know it's been a little while. Let me just tell you, Tamir Rice was a 12-year-old kid in Cleveland playing in a park with a pellet gun. And somebody in a nearby house called 911, said, hey, there's somebody in the park has a gun. It might be a toy, though. Somehow that last part never made it through the dispatch system. The police are called, but rather than pull up and take a safe position, they rolled right up on Tamir, and within 3 seconds, he was killed by Officer Timothy Lohman. Now, so many things went wrong in this scenario that I would need a whole other lecture to talk about that. But let's just focus on the results of this experiment, this idea of overestimating age, size, and so forth. This is how Officer Lohman described Tamir in his police report. He appeared to be over 18 years of age and 185 pounds. All right. 50% wrong or more on age and wrong on the weight too. And amazingly, prosecutors decide they're going to carry this forward, or maybe without realizing it, as they get into the case weeks later when, of course, all of the facts and figures about Tamir are well known already. He was big for his age with a men's XL jacket and size 36 pants. Could easily have passed for someone much older. You decide. You decide. Much older. Yeah. So you can see the incredible effect that race has just on how people perceive their environment and perceive danger. Eberhardt and Goff and their team on the visual processing experiment have this phrase that has always stuck with me. Race acts as a visual tuning device. It literally tunes the visual system and the human brain in this country. So if that's the effect of race, let's spend a few minutes talking about fear. Now, I think when I talk about fear, what will easily come to your mind is the fear that people of color have when they encounter police. This is perhaps not a surprise to you at this point, closing in on 6 months or so after the death of George Floyd and so many others. Maybe you've been thinking about what it would be like. But this is a constant in the lives of Black people. You may not feel the same kind of fear when you encounter police, but Black people, this is a generational thing. You can't talk to a Black person, a Black adult in this country, and usually a Black teenager, without hearing about their own difficult encounters with police or hearing the stories that they were told by grandparents, parents, uncles, aunts, brothers, sisters, friends, everybody. It's all over the community. This really comes home to me when I read the writing of Nicole Hannah Jones, who I want to show you next. She's got a series of essays. This was the person who was behind. I'm having a little difficulty finding the old cursor thing here. Okay, there we go. She was behind the 1619 Project and so many other things. But I always prize this piece from one of her essays. Um, she's writing here for white readers, trying to explain to them why Black people simply do not trust the justice system or the police. And she says it's possible this will come as a surprise to you, but to a very real extent, you have grown up in a different country than I have. A different country. Now, that may come off to you at first like hyperbole, but it's not. I mean, it is so different. The experience of people of color with police, especially, but also the courts and the law generally, so different that it's almost another world, right? Pay attention. You want to get more of a direct slice of this. Think about how Black parents must prepare their children for this world. You may have heard of this thing called the talk, right? Where Black parents talk to their children when they hit driving age about not if, but when the police stop them, how they must act, not to be polite, but in order to survive the encounter. You want to have your heart broken? Watch this 4-minute video, which I won't show you now, but you can find it. It's called Dear Child. Now, if that maybe isn't as surprising to you as anything, it may surprise you that I'm also thinking about and also wrote about fear on the other side of the police encounter, the fear in police officers. Why would we think of that, right? Aren't police officers brave and courageous? Well, yes, they are. I mean, think of what former President Obama used to say. Police are the people who run toward the danger when the rest of us are running away. And that's true. That is true. But the presence of bravery and courage do not mean there is an absence of fear. And unfortunately, we have come to the point in police training and police culture generally throughout this country where we amp up the fear police have rather than the opposite. And the result has been disastrous. Let me tell you what I mean. This book, widely available, it's called On Combat, The Psychology and Physiology of Deadly Conflict in War and Peace, written by Dave Grossman. Dave Grossman trains thousands of police officers every year. There's a whole industry of private police training. And this is attended usually at cost by people, often out of their own pocket, sometimes at the cost of the police department, police officers who are already on the job. But his philosophy in this book and elsewhere, and you can find his videos all over YouTube, has come to pervade 21st century policing in a very unfortunate way, both the training and the larger culture. His take on policing is the police officer must be a warrior. This is about combat. The police officer has to be a warrior. You deal with this fear by becoming a warrior, right? As far as the fear, he tells police officers, deadly danger, the risk of death is present in every civilian encounter you have until proven otherwise. Everyone, not just a tiny fraction, as is actually the case if we look at the data, not just some or many or any, no wiggle words here. Everyone until proven otherwise. The only way you can meet this is to become a warrior, and you meet it and you're ready for it because you are ready as a warrior to use righteous violence to reply to the danger. His favorite metaphor beyond just war and warrior itself is the sheep and the sheepdogs. Most of us are sheep. We're just happy to, do our stuff and eat our grass. But the wolves lurk everywhere, ready to rip out our throats. And it's only the sheepdogs, the police, that keep us safe. What does the warrior mindset look like and feel like? Well, I came across this set of startling interviews and an essay by this gentleman, Patrick Skinner, who's actually on a police force in Georgia. He's ex-CIA, and he says, look, this is exactly what police training does. Every situation is not just can be dangerous, but it will be dangerous because we're in a war on crime and anyone can kill you. In the essay from the day before, just reading the last few lines, what our society finds so distressing in police interactions, disrespect, anger, frustration, and violence is not a result of flawed training. It's a result of training for war. In war, you have casualties. In war, you have collateral damage. It's a war. How else is this fear ramped up? Videos. There is a virtual canon, C-A-N-O-N, of police videos, usually from dash cams like this one. And I'm not going to show this. But this is one that is very commonly shown. It's shown to the rawest recruits, whole bunches of them. And these videos feature a civilian, usually during a traffic stop, but other settings too, murdering a police officer right on camera, shooting them, stabbing them, assaulting them, killing them. You experience this death as if it is yours. You can see the bullet hole on the screen. You can see the man holding the firearm. Right? Would it be okay or maybe a good thing to show these things, to show tactical mistakes? Maybe, but that's not why they're shown. They're shown to let recruits and others know this is the world that you are stepping into. Anybody can do this to you, and it happens. Now, of course, cameras are everywhere. There's video of everything. So I'm sure we could find many millions more videos of things going just fine for every one of these, but those don't get shown. There's also, to add to the danger, the ubiquitous presence of guns. There's fear on both sides. So let's return to the story for just a moment. We eventually go to court. Here we are in Pittsburgh. There's our federal courthouse for 2 trials in the case of Jordan Miles versus the city of Pittsburgh and the 3 police officers. There are 2 full cases on 3 civil claims. This is for damages. It's all Jordan can do now. He doesn't have the power to put in criminal charges. The 3 charges are abusive process, false arrest, excessive force. In the first trial, the police win the abusive process claim. There's a hung jury on the other 2, and the other 2 is really where the ball game is, right? False arrest and excessive force. In the second trial, verdict for Jordan on false arrest, damages awarded. Verdict for the police on excessive force. What? Nobody was satisfied with this. Nobody knew what to make of this. Jordan's lawyers immediately declared they'd be going back for a 3rd trial. City's lawyers said, we want all the damages reversed. Jordan was the only person who could salvage anything here, it seemed. And he came straight out a couple of days later and he basically said, I'll paraphrase, he said, all I ever wanted was for somebody who was in charge to say what happened to me was wrong. And I kind of got it. 6 months, 8 months later, it took for the city and Jordan's lawyers to work out a final deal, and the case was over. 6.5 years. So what could we do to avoid things like this? This has to go. This whole mindset, the training, everything. It must be replaced by guardian type policing. Now, what is that? The best place to get yourself schooled in guardian style policing is from the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, published under the Obama administration. Plenty of examples and ways to train and so forth. It has policing that focuses on serving people, protecting everyone, and keeping order. It's not first and foremost about crime fighting, which leads to disaster in a war on crime. What does it look like? Great essay over this past summer. Choosing their own side if you're warriors, but if you're a guardian, you choose the side of the law and the people you're sworn to protect. If you're a warrior, you dehumanize your enemy. That's how you can kill them. If you're a guardian, you see individual people. If you're a warrior, you survive by reaction and using deadly violence. If you're a guardian, you slow down, you think, you ask, you doubt. Second thing, use of force law has to change. Here's Governor Gavin Newsom signing AB 392 in California in 2019. This was the first state law change in use of force law. We've used the US Supreme Court standard for decades, but we don't have to stay with it. We can do better. California changed its law. DC has changed its use of force law because it acts like a state locally. There's a use of force change proposed in Pennsylvania by our very own Representative Summer Lee from this county, along with Representatives Ed Gainey and Jake Wheatley. It's sitting in the legislature without action. We must do this. The cities can pass their own use of force laws. They can make their police department change their use of force policies. Transparency and accountability are fundamental. Transparency and accountability. You have to have transparency about misconduct and discipline, because only then can you have accountability. Unfortunately, in most states, the law still shields police disciplinary and conduct records from public view. So the public doesn't really know what's going on. This man on the right is Jamie Calvin. He's a journalist and somewhat of a human rights activist in Chicago, and he got this changed for the entire state of Illinois. All police disciplinary records there are now public. And if they can do it for Chicago, you can do it anywhere. California changed its law. New York changed its law in reaction to George Floyd's murder just this year. It can be done. Let me skip the following slide here just to get to another thing, because I'm conscious of our time running out. We need to decriminalize and not just weed. We need to think to ourselves, what do we actually need to be criminal offenses? Sure, DWI may be reckless driving, but other things? No, we don't need those to be criminal offenses. How about sleeping in public areas, also known as homelessness? No, that doesn't need to be a crime. How about drug offenses tied to addiction? That doesn't need to be a crime. And with everything you decriminalize, you minimize the number of police encounters. What about this? I'm sure you've heard about it. Do we defund the police or even abolish the police, as they have tried to do in Minneapolis? I understand the impulse, but I don't think that's the right way to think about it. Is it really about abolishing it, police, or is it about changing priorities, budget expenditures, and ways of delivering police services? Can you imagine not having any police? Well, maybe I can't. I'm a middle-aged white person who's always been well served by the police. But if I was a person who, when I called because my car got stolen, they put me in handcuffs, yeah, maybe I could. If when my house was getting broken into and I called the police, they put my kids on the floor with guns on them, maybe I could. In any case, we need to have that in mind, right? Their experience, the experience of people of color, is so different, a different country. So unbundle what police do so we can reimagine it. Ask what police do all the way. Do we want people with badges and guns doing these things? We want them responding to serious crimes, but non-criminal responses, things like burglar alarms or dogs that are loud, mental health crisis, homelessness, drug addiction, those things, we don't need people with guns and handcuffs for that. We need social workers. So ask this question and reimagine your police, reimagine them, and then transfer the resources with the responsibility. The last thing I would tell you, you got to invest. This is the community where the incident happened, but it doesn't have to be this way. Homewood can look like this. This is a development that was put together by a church in Homewood, the Everyday Cafe. I've eaten there. I meet people there. It's a great place. Pitt has its own stake down here. The Community Engagement Center is actually in Homewood. So there are ways to do this work. I guess I'll close here. I am grateful for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I look forward to Professor Davis's comments and any questions you might have. Thank you a lot.
Well, thank you, Professor Harris. That was really great. And if you haven't read the book, it's really a great book. And I didn't know much about the situation, or I didn't know anything about the situation. But opening the first chapter and reading the story from the police's point of view, you come off thinking, yeah, that seems reasonable. They didn't know what was going on. Then you read the story from the young black man's point of view, and it's like, whoa, this is like, these are two totally different incidents. If you read the story, it's really a great book, and it walks you through the court, something I also didn't know about, that if you don't take a settlement, then you can't reap, the payment of the fees and the fee structures and things that change if you don't take a settlement offer. I thought was very interesting.
Thank you.
But I guess a few comments I have just to get your thoughts on that idea of the race and fear, right? I think that's like a central part of a foundation part in the middle of the book. And I'm just talking, that just makes me wonder about this war mentality, right? So if you have this already, you already have a component of race and fear, then you have this war mentality, which helps dehumanize, and also I believe turns up the fear, which feeds into that like a racial fear feedback system, to whereas that these people who are scary are now even more scary because they're on the other side of not just the city or city lines or something like that. They're on the other side of humanity now. And so, just the thoughts about how that intersection works. And also, I mean, I think especially reading the book and seeing how the court cases turned out and the monies were paid out, I think, I don't know what the legal structure, and maybe you can speak to this, is that, it seems even if police are held accountable, so even if the cop is held accountable and fired, the money paid out never comes from the police. It always comes from the city or county or something like that. And I would think that it would have to be some type of situation to whereas the police had to not take it out of their budget, but some accountability financially from the police department itself. Even like doctors have to have malpractice insurance. If they had to put money into a fund that could go to paying out these types of fines and fees, and if they don't get one, it goes back to them at the end of the year, like bonuses or something like that, to have some type of financial incentive not to do these things, which will cause people to step in, with a duty to assist or something like that. Just your kind of thoughts on that. But thank you for the presentation. It was nice.
Oh, the pleasure's mine. Believe me, you asked a couple of great questions. You're right in the center of the target. You have a feedback loop going with the warrior mentality. If you're a warrior, you're at war, you have enemies, everybody's an enemy, and pretty soon the whole thing is a race and fear feedback loop. And that has a terribly deleterious effect, not only on the people around you who are subject to your instantaneous reactions, but also on the individual officer, because they're constantly have to be hyper vigilant all the time. It is just like being in war. It is about the worst thing that one can think of for a civilian job in a civilian context. Your comments about money and so forth and damages, again, right on target. When something is external to you, the economists tell me, you don't care. They call that externalizing, right? So if the police officer, let alone the police department, if they don't pay these damages, what do they care? It just becomes the cost of doing business. And we're now reading about cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles among them, but other cities too, paying out so many millions of dollars over the years. These cities will self-insure, so they would pay it out of their own treasury. but it's getting to the point where they're actually floating municipal bonds to
Wow.
pay the money. And
Wow.
there's somebody making money on this. And these are effectively police abuse bond issues. And it's just something so wrong about that. But
Mhm.
on the question that you raised, which is really incentives, there's some very interesting work being done now. The person who I know the best who's doing this is Professor Deborah Ramirez at Northeastern University in Boston. I had her on my podcast a month or two ago, and she's got a whole proposal for having police officers, as you say, carry some kind of insurance.
Mhm.
They'd get baseline insurance for the job. But if their claims history, think of driving and accidents and
Mhm.
stuff, if the claims history goes crazy, they're going to have to pay more and eventually they'd be priced out of the job. Not everybody loves the idea of the market taking care of this, and we know there are market failures, but people are thinking of things just like this because the damage is so incredibly great. And I wouldn't pass on one of the things you said sort of implicitly. I think this money should come out of the police department budget. That would get their attention. At the very least, they should have to go to a hearing every time the city council is asked to approve a damage payment and explain.
Mhm. And I think another recent example of this, the intersection of race and fear, is just what they're protesting and writing about well, this guy was mentally ill. He's out there with his mother. She's trying to calm him down. They call the police. He has a knife in his hand. He's 15, 20 feet away from the police officer. Both officers open fire on him and murder him in the street. He has a knife. He's like, I mean, it's just that idea, I think, is exemplified of that idea of fear.
Yes. Oh, yes. It's a
Yeah.
terrible thing. I mean, this is another good reason that we need to reimagine policing. If you have somebody in a mental health crisis, you can send out a police officer with the best level of mental health training called CIT training, crisis
Mhm.
intervention training. And that's helpful. But even better would be a trained mental health worker, maybe in a team with the officer. So the officer can back away unless there's danger. Models like this are popping up all over the country, and there's been a system like this in Eugene, Oregon for 3 decades. It goes by the name Cahoots, which is not some kind of way to be cute. It actually stands for something that I can't remember, but they have a mental health team that rolls out whenever there's a call. And if they need the police, they call them in. And I heard a guy interviewed about this. He said, like, I've been there 25 years. There's been a handful of times we called in the police. So if we had the responsibility distributed for this to actors who actually know what they're doing, everybody'd be better off.
Thank you. Do you have any questions from the?
So we actually have a question um, from the audience, Thomas Waters. Thomas, I don't know if you want to ask your question. I see you unmuted yourself now. Okay, so I mean, I can ask the question. We can't hear you. Um, so his question is changes in policing from recruiting to training to mentoring to policy changes to continuing education may make for better policing. But will these do enough to change the level of distrust so many in the community feel towards the police? What can be done to truly rebuild trust between the community and the police?
This is a great question, and it's a central question. It's good to see you, Thomas. You and I have talked on the phone. We've never met in person. Um, the, um, the question of rebuilding trust is fundamental, if in my opinion. If the police and the people they serve don't trust each other, they're going to have a very difficult time creating public safety together. And public safety is something that is created not just by policing. It's created by the people who are served, and it must be the kind of public safety they want created in the way that they want. So the first thing that has to happen is that police have to understand that trust is broken. And just because they think we have the best training, we're the greatest, we have no incidents, blah, blah, blah. If your public, if your members of your community are telling you in polls and surveys, in meetings, we don't trust you, you have a problem whether you think you have it or not. Once you've acknowledged that, you must begin by listening. listening, not explaining to them what you do or how you do it or why, but listening. That is the most important thing. And then the community must listen to police too. It's a joint formula. But in an overall sense, this is how it would get started. Okay. And it has to continue. There has to be continuous communication that will be very difficult at first, but it must continue like that as long as it takes, because the only way to actually have trust when you need it is to build it before you need it. It's like having a bank. You got to put your savings in, and then when you have something that you need it for, you can draw on it, right? So you have to be cautious about this all the time. You can't just turn to the community and, in a crisis moment and say, why don't you trust us? What can we do about it? You have to be doing it now for the long term. And that begins with speaking, listening, relationships.
Just to follow up on that, can you think of any communities where that kind of approach has really been successful? Where, I think a lot of us are really struggling right now, that this issue of trust is such a huge one.
Yeah.
Sector. I mean, from policing to you name it, especially with the pandemic, a lot of these issues have been.
Yeah, it's a very difficult moment right now. It really is. And because it's so difficult for everybody right now, I'll reach for some other times where I've seen it work. I can tell you that actually here in Pittsburgh, in the aftermath of the federal, remember I talked about how the U.S. attorney said, we'll not prosecute this case. We just can't do it. We don't have the evidence because the legal standard is too high. That U.S. attorney happened to be a Pitt Law alum. He's a very good man. His name is David Hickton. He's a personal friend. I want to concede that right out loud. And in the aftermath of that, he was looking for a way to move forward and regain the trust of people in the African American community who believed that he should have gone forward with the case. And I happen to have some relationships, some encounters with people who worked for Mr. Hickton. I didn't know him yet at that point. And I gave them ideas about what I had seen in other places. And I said, you got to start by talking, you bring everybody together, and then you bring law enforcement in. And long story short, Mr. Hickton became the convener of the community police action group, I think is what we called ourselves. It started with a process very much like what I had just described a minute ago. And for the 6 more years that he was in office, it served a very good purpose. There were relationships built when something would go wrong, and something did go wrong during our time together. There were other incidents here in Pittsburgh after the Jordan Miles case, some of which are in the epilogue. These people in that room, on law enforcement side, on the civil rights or African American community side, they had each other to turn to get the real facts, to rely on each other. Another example that I remember came from Boston years ago. The commissioner there was Paul Evans, and he had built very solid relationships over time with people in the Black community as they constructed what came to be called the Boston Miracle, which was reducing juvenile gun homicides from really an out-of-control plague to zero. And there's a whole story behind that. It's in my 2005 book and many other places. Pardon me. Paul Evans was a commissioner there for about 7 years, and that's a long time to run a police agency. There was a terrible incident in Boston in which police in the Boston Police Department shot into a moving car, and they killed a young woman who was a mother in that car, not the driver. And there was a big outcry, and he put into place an immediate policy change in which he said, thou shalt not shoot at moving cars. Right? This is a best practice that's been established for a long time, but it had not been established there. And immediately the union went after him and called for his resignation and had a vote of no confidence. Well, he had put enough trust in the bank. He had done enough with people when the crisis was not there, that when that happened, there was a news conference, and who was standing around him but the members of the community said, no, this is our guy. He's been with us. We've been through it with him and we're not giving him up. So these are examples from elsewhere and different problems, but I think the theme is the same. You have to build toward this when the crisis is not in your face. And you have to know you're doing it all the time. It is every single encounter a police officer has with a civilian must be seen as an opportunity to build a relationship relentlessly, no exceptions.
All right, thank you. Do we have any more questions? We've already reached an hour, but just in case others have some questions. I just want to wrap up with one final question for you, just about the dynamics here in Pittsburgh, just because we've had so many important discussions on this over the past couple of months. But have you seen these dynamics really change here since the events that you describe in your book?
I think it's fair to say I end the book without a lot of optimism, which is, I felt kind of sad about that. But, if you look at the years after the incident with Jordan, there were worse incidents that followed. We had a very good period of time when we were under an outsider police chief here named Cam McClay, and things really did seem to be building in a positive direction, and trust really increased in the police department. The current chief, Scott Schubert, has made it his policy to double down on what Chief McClay was doing, and I want to say I'm encouraged about that. But there are some real solid steps that the police department needs to take. I was part of the mayor's task force on police reform that wrapped up its process and delivered its report last Monday. And among the things we recommended were much greater attention to not just data gathering and data systems, but what the data we have actually shows, which is that racial disparities pervade even the very basic data we have. You see them across all the routine police activities, traffic stops and frisks and all those routine activities. There is a measurable racial disparity, and this has happened even as the Pittsburgh Police Department has ramped down certain of its enforcement activities. So their encounters are going down. The disparity is actually increasing. And so there are very basic things they need to pay attention to here. Racial disparity is just one of them. They need to change their use of force policy in some significant ways. And right now, after the incidents that followed George Floyd's murder, there were incidents involving crowd control. They need to do a very serious examination of how they handled that. Not just those incidents, but how they'll do it going forward. So there's a lot that needs to be done here, though we're in a reasonably good place compared to some others.
All right, thank you. I don't know if anyone has any more comments or questions before we wrap this up for the afternoon. But Professor Harris, just want to thank you for spending with us again. We really enjoyed, always learned so much from you, Professor Davis. Thank you again for being with us this week. This has been just such a fantastic series. I think we've really learned so much. And if folks don't know, you can watch all of our the recordings of all of the speakers that we've had. We've had book launches, a conversation with the mayor, with Professors Davis and Professor Harris. We've had so many academic talks, people presenting research on such diverse topics related to this issue. So really a wealth of knowledge for people to draw on as they think about making their own policy conclusions or thinking about further research and ways forward. So thanks to all of you for being with us today.
Thank you. I really appreciate the center for hosting this, and I appreciate Professor Davis very much. It's been a real pleasure to be engaged with you, and I look forward to the next time our paths cross.
Yeah, I think likewise. Thank you.
All right.
All right. Hopefully, thank you.